The London Gem and Mineral Show is back, taking place at Sandown Park Racecourse on Saturday the 23rd and Sunday the 24th of November. Experience the best of the crystal, mineral and fossil industry as we gather the finest specimens over 2 unforgettable days. You can discover hands-on workshops and activities, crack open your own geodes and delve into talks from the industry experts. And not forgetting that the Opal Whisperers from the Discovery Channel are back, coming all the way from Australia with some show-exclusive pieces in tow. So what are you waiting for? Join us for an immersive journey at the London Gem and Mineral Show, where traders and enthusiasts alike are invited to discover the Earth's natural treasures all under one roof. Book now at thegemandmineralshow.com or follow us on Instagram at The Gem and Mineral Show. We'll see you there. Want to discover London like never before? Step beyond the surface with WOW Tours. Explore the city's hidden spiritual secrets, walk ancient ley lines and uncover the mysteries of London's past, present and future. Brought to you by Wisdom on Wellness and led by renowned crystal author and Akashic Records reader Gemma Petherbridge, these are more than just tours. They're journeys into the heart of London's esoteric history. Book your spot today and see London through a whole new lens. Visit wowtourslondon.com for tickets. Hello and welcome back to the Wow Talks podcast. We are so pleased to bring you an inspiring conversation between our wonderful host Sarah Lamptey and the amazing Caggie Dunlop, which was recorded live at our festival this summer. Now, Caggie is a leading voice in personal development and spirituality with a strong focus on astrology, relationships, identity, creativity, and life's purpose. And as the visionary behind the Saturn Returns podcast, which was launched in 2019 and one of my own personal favourite podcasts, Caggie explores the life-shifting transition known as the Saturn Return, which occurs around every 29 years. Caggie features thought leaders from across the globe and offers powerful insights for anyone on their own journey of self-awareness. And we were so thrilled to have Caggie speak at WowFest, and on a personal note, it was so lovely to meet Caggie. She's as lovely as she comes across on the podcast. And as someone who's resonated so much with her by listening to her podcast that's helped me and inspired me through many moments of self-doubt in the past few years. So it was a wonderful full circle moment for me having her at our own festival this year. So I really do hope that her wisdom will resonate with many of you, and I hope you enjoy. Let's dive in.
So hi, I'm Sarah. I don't know if you've been here earlier today or yesterday, but I'm your host. I'm presenting. It's my absolute pleasure to be introducing our next guest. And I hope you've had a great wellness festival so far. It's been beautiful. I've been able to sort of wander around a little bit and it's just been so great seeing what else is on the site. So thank you for sharing your time with us here when there's so much else to do. And we're sponsored by Jasper Cacao, which is fantastic. And we've had some brilliant, brilliant guests sharing their stories, sharing their journeys. And of course, we have no exception in the form of Caggie Dunlop. Welcome.
Hello. Thank you so much for having me. And hello, everyone. Welcome, welcome.
I'm going to jump straight into it because there's so much to talk about. And we are going to do a Q&A towards the end, probably 15 minutes before the end or something like that. So but we'll see how we go. I want it to be as free and as lovely and as natural as possible. We're all here in this room together, which is wonderful. I have to say from the very beginning, I hadn't heard of a Saturn Return.
Oh.
I hadn't, or if I hadn't sort of gleaned much knowledge from it, essentially. Mm-hmm. And so when I was researching it, it was just absolutely fascinating. And it was incredible because I noticed all these points in my life and it felt like I just went, oh yeah, okay, this sort of makes sense around my 30th birthday and what went on and how much of it was a bit more cosmic or more going on than actually I sort of realised at the time. It was really, really interesting. The concept is fascinating and powerful. And of course, you launched your Saturn Returns podcast in 2019. When did you first discover and delve into the influence of Saturn Return?
Yeah, so for those that might not be familiar, my name is Caggie Dunlop and I am the host and founder of a podcast called Saturn Returns and author of the Saturn Returns book. And the concept is basically something that happens in your life at around 29 and a half years when Saturn returns to the same place in the sky it was when you were born, and you go through this sort of initiation into adulthood. And I was living in LA at about 20, I was 27, and I started to sort of feel this shift happening in my life, and a lot of coping strategies that had been sufficient so far were just no longer working. And I felt like I was having to sort of face myself head on in a way that I didn't feel entirely comfortable with. And someone told me that I was about to go through my Saturn return. And I've always been into spirituality and philosophy, and astrology was of interest to me, but I wasn't really well versed on the subject at all. But for whatever reason, this particular transit just had me hooked. And I thought, why does no one know about this? If it's such a big deal, why aren't people talking about it? And as everybody that's living in LA at the time, at some point will probably do, as I was like, right, well, I'm going to write a script called Saturn Returns. And it's going to be about people that are going through this period of life. They don't know what is going on. And it's going to be a kind of funny comedy thing. And anyway, I started writing this idea, and then I was like, actually, I don't know what I'm going to do with this. So I sort of parked it and carried on with what I was doing at the time, which was music. And I came back to London, and I was putting out music, and I was kind of pursuing that. And then a few things just kind of started falling into place and also falling apart, which is very much what your Saturn Returns is about. It kind of is paradoxical in that sense. It's like it makes things that are not meant for you crumble so that you can build things on solid foundations in a more authentic and truthful way. And I went through a pretty brutal breakup, which is quite classic in your Saturn Return.
So did I.
Yeah. and they're often very, I use this term sort of guillotine style. It's just like suddenly it's done. And then you're sort of faced with the reality of a blank canvas, which, as we all know, like approaching 30 is quite scary, because we're sold this idea that everything is going to have filed itself into some sort of meaning and order, and that we know who we are and what we're supposed to be doing, and we're in the right relationship. And then suddenly we realize that is not what's happened at all. And a lot of people kept asking me whether I had any interest in doing a podcast. And then I basically decided, I was like, right, I've gone through my Saturn return at that point. Like, I'd literally just come out the other end, and I felt ready and stable enough in myself. And I was like, the podcast needs to be about these themes, and so that I can share it with as many people as possible who might be going through a similar sort of experience to me. And then it also was the pandemic, which was a convenient coincidence, because the tagline of the show is "You are not alone." So that lent itself to that moment in time a little bit.
Perfect. You're ahead of it all. How long does it last? I mean, can you sort of quantify it in that kind of those terms? How long does it last, this return?
So you have, it's like 2.5, 3 years, and it basically will have like a period that's like, a lot of emotional stuff comes to the surface, a lot of uncertainty, and then you have like a very intense period, and then the sort of like shadow tail off part. So I'm actually about to launch a Saturn Returns calculator, which will show you the date that your Saturn return is happening. If you're lucky, you'll have 3 in your lifetime, because of course it's roughly every 30 years, so 29.5 years. So you have your first, and then your second one as you're approaching 60, and then, hopefully approaching 90. But it's a specific date that it will be occurring, but it's like the chunk of that will be around 9 months, and then there's like the areas either side. So you're going to be going through a lot of changes over that time, usually.
So you actually discovered the concept prior to your Saturn return?
Prior to my Saturn return.
So were you sort of looking out for it almost?
No, but I would say by the work that I do, I've created a sort of community of people who are sort of Saturnophobic, I like to say, because they'll come to my shows and they're like, what's going to happen? When's it happening? And like a bit fearful about it, which is definitely not my intention, because Saturn ultimately seeks our excellence. So it's nothing to be frightened of. But it's quite funny how, I heard about the idea or concept, went through it. And when I was going through it, I wasn't thinking very much, I'm going through my Saturn return. I was just thinking, why is everyone else's life falling into place and mine feels like everything's being turned upside down? And I can tell you now that like everyone actually feels like it's being turned upside down. Yeah.
For me, it was, I was in a relationship for 10 years and I really wanted it to work, and I just knew, and that guillotine sort of made sense. I sort of knew, no, this isn't right. And it was right around that time. What is it that makes Saturn so powerful? So you say that Saturn wants our excellence. Can you talk a little bit more about that and its influence?
Yeah, so Saturn as a planet is associated with karma, restriction, boundaries, discipline, responsibility, sort of the father archetype. So it's quite stern in its presence, but it kind of has this ability to make you embody these characteristics more. So if, like me, you were living in sort of not a very authentic way, not being very boundaried or disciplined about anything. And our 20s are often just like a series of messy experiences anyway. And I think they're supposed to be, but that's a different story. And so Saturn kind of comes along to make you look at your life so far and how you've been living, and gives you this sort of assessment from the universe. It's like, well, you reap what you sow. And for the last 10 decades, like, what have you been doing? So I did say that for everyone, it feels like things are falling apart. It's important to mention that actually for some people, it can be a solidifying of things that have been in motion for a while. So if you are on the right track, in the right relationship, pursuing the right career, it can mean just an up-leveling. So you might get that promotion, you might get an opportunity to move abroad with the job that you're doing, and you might just, get married and have children. But it's been my experience, and judging by sort of how the podcast has resonated with people, that for a lot, it feels like things are falling apart.
Do we become wiser with each return? Is this the idea that we sort of do level up and we have more experience, and we consciously prepare for our return as well?
So for the first part of that question, I think we all know that age doesn't always bring wisdom, but that is the idea. And I think the more sort of self-awareness you have when you're sort of going through these life transitions and acknowledging like the shadow aspects that might be coming to the surface and the coping strategies that really are not healthy, and just knowing actually who you are and what works for you, whilst you have your sort of Saturn return that happens 29 and a half years, it's worth mentioning that you also have Saturn squares and oppositions. And Saturn, like the Earth, has seasons, and each season is 7 years. So every 7 years, we have these mini visits or initiations. And if you actually look back at your life and think of these periods of, like, if anyone can remember what they were like at 7, I can't particularly, but 7, 14, 21, up until your Saturn return, and so on and so forth, you kind of notice these big themes of authority, responsibility, a sense of your own autonomy and trying to sort of be an adult in the world, but also the sort of external figures that kind of push up against you as well. So it is a constant process. And now I'm going through another Saturn square, or about to myself. I hope that I'm aware enough to notice the lessons, but at the same time, you just never really know which way things are going to take you. And sometimes you just have to surrender and trust.
Is that the main sort of guidance that you give when it comes to people approaching their Saturn returns? Or, like you said, those Saturnophobic people, is that sort of part of it?
Well, it stems from a space, and I know that space well, of trying to control. You want, if you know what's going to happen and you think you can anticipate the next thing that's around the corner, you can prepare yourself for it. But we all know that life doesn't work that way. And it's often the most painful, unexpected experiences that actually craft us into the people we're meant to be. But I also, before your Saturn return, I think you feel this intense pressure of time, like you have this limited this window of opportunity is closing before your very eyes. And so you're trying to micromanage everything. And a big thing for me, and I think this is quite common, is you get stuck in this role in your own story of the victim. You're like, things are happening to me. And you kind of get in this quite negative loop. And I think your Saturn return is very much about breaking out of that. But paradoxically, it will often bring things that will make you feel a bit more like a victim until you choose to say otherwise and approach it differently and change your perspective.
That's brought up something actually that I was sort of formulating in my mind, trying to work out how can we have a sense of autonomy if we have to also surrender and know that there's a lot that's out of our control and that Saturn is such a major influence. How do we sort of...
Yeah, and I think that's the sort of the beautiful thing, isn't it? It's a dance between the two. It's not fate versus free will. We have this beautiful blueprint of our birth charts and this cosmos around us that I believe is obviously going to be playing a part in how things unfold. And there's a communication of sorts going on between the two, the sort of inner worlds and the outer ones. Having your own autonomy over things is about the internal work. So I'm a big believer in, you notice people sort of chasing the external, and they're like, oh, well, if I get that job or that partner and, tick these boxes, then I'll be happy because that's what society has told me. Whereas actually it's about sort of going inward and watering your own internal world, and then externally things will flourish. And even when you're going through a tough transition, you have this sort of anchoring in yourself that gives you this ability to weather the storm. It's like, you can be sitting there and be like, I have no idea what way my life is about to go or what's about to unfold, but I feel calm in myself. And I think that's the trick.
Yeah, the trick, and definitely the power, I think. And it's one. Do you find that that's something you're constantly working on as well, even with all the work that you've done with Saturn Returns? And do you feel like it's something that takes constant practice, a labour?
I do, and I think it's like any of these things. It's in the sort of day-to-day disciplines that build up over time. It's not a quick fix, and that sort of anchoring in yourself and that ability to know that you can handle things, that you have all the equipment and you have all the knowledge, is like all those incremental moments built up over time.
Absolutely. When I was researching and looking a little bit at your life, it really resonated when you spoke about the two conflicting human tendencies to want to be one's authentic self, but also to strive to fit in. And I think probably everyone in this room would be able to relate to that state and feeling both those states at the same time. How can we best navigate our lives with those opposites that play within us, wanting to fit in, but also to wanting to be authentic?
So I did steal that from the great Gabor Mate. He speaks about it a lot. And I think it's particularly prevalent in our teenage years. That's when we start, I believe, discarding the aspects of ourselves that make us stand out, that make us different, that make us other. And we want to fit in. We're wired to be part of a community and a tribe. So we sort of start adopting mannerisms or ways of being that may not be truthful to us, but they allow us to be part of something. And we also know how cruel people can be in their teenage years as well. And then we kind of go through our 20s as a continuation of this. And sometimes we get to a point where we've formed a version of ourselves that we've sort of created in order to survive in many ways. And we then don't really recognize who we are anymore because we're so used to sort of shape-shifting to be who we need to be liked and loved and fit in, sometimes not in the right places. And then your Saturn return is very much a moment where you have this beautiful opportunity to reconnect with those parts of yourself that you'd slightly left behind or turned your back on or deemed not worthy of being seen. And it's very often those things that make you be exactly who you're supposed to be. And it's about reclaiming those parts. But the scary thing is, I always say there's this sort of self-inflicted exile that we go through at this stage where we know where we're not supposed to be, and we know perhaps it's the friendship circle that we've outgrown that we no longer feel is going to bring out the best in us. In fact, it might bring out the worst. Or it's a relationship or whatever it might be, or it could be family dynamics, or it could be all of the above. And we have to have the courage to sort of step out into the void, into the wilderness, into the unknown, and start embracing those aspects of us that we kept hidden away. And only when we do that do we find the people that are in true alignment. And I think what the problem is, people try and get the people before making the jump. They think, well, if I'm not going to leave where I am right now. I'm not going to leave, these friends because I don't know how to find my tribe or how to find my community or the career I want to do. But sometimes Julia Cameron says, leap and the net shall appear. And I always think that that's such wonderful advice.
I think leaping into the unknown is just terrifying.
It is terrifying.
Because it's, even if you know the situation that you're in is destructive or unhelpful, it's still the only one that you've known. And there's this phrase about better the devil you know. And I think, that's almost, I think, what we cling to, really.
Yeah, and to go back to the sort of the authentic self versus the need to fit in, we're so focused on being in the mind and in the sort of logical part of our brain that we'll use reason to sort of weigh up the pros and cons of all that we know in the current moment. But actually, if we can trust our hearts and our intuition more, they're often in conflict with our head. And we've all been in that position where our intuition is telling us a very inconvenient truth that we don't want to listen to. And so we use our logic and our linear thinking minds to stay in a place that we have outgrown because we're afraid. But hopefully we've all also had those experiences where we do feel the call and we do listen to our intuition and we have the courage to take that leap. And it pays off.
Absolutely. And you talk about the inner child work being the key to connection and belonging, the part of you that holds your core needs, desires, emotions. And I love that you've got your free meditation on your website, which I did. And you talk in that through sitting, finding, soothing, I would say, your inner child. And I think so many of us and so many of the conversations today have talked about how we're so clogged with technology. We know that it's not great, but then there's part of us that feels we need it just to be a part of society as we know it. And when it comes to stillness and work within, do some people feedback that they find it hard to find their inner child, to sort of access that who you are right in your core, to make way for this kind of work?
I don't think we live in a society that practices sort of the capacity to self-regulate from a very young age. And in terms of people not being able to access their inner child, I think everyone's inner child is like grabbing hold of the wheel most of the time, especially in quite emotionally intense situations. And a way to sort of always be able to discern whether that is happening. I love this line which says, if it's hysterical, it's historical. So if you've had a sort of very unmeasured reaction to a situation that really isn't that big a deal, perhaps it's your partner's made a flippant comment to you that he thought was funny and you've like completely lost your shit about it. But, and then you're suddenly like, whoa, where did that come from? Like, that's an example of your inner child is essentially acting out and grabbing the wheel. And
actually, it might be that we're almost trying too hard to there's the idea about sort of searching for your inner.
I don't think you need to search for it. I think it's there all the time. I think it's more about acknowledging when it's coming out. And then do you have the tools to self-regulate or sort of sit with that aspect of yourself and have compassion for that part of yourself? And back to the thing you said about technology, because it's still relatively new in terms of we don't really know the impact that that's having on our brains, our wiring, our psychology, let alone for children. If you're on the tube or any like commute going to work, if you actually put away your phone and look at people, you can see very clearly if they're having a thought that is emotional, something that they don't really want to deal with. And immediately it's like this default setting, they just grab their phone. So it's become this thing that's a normalized way of constantly numbing. And when people do that through drugs and alcohol and online shopping and all sorts of things. But technology has definitely become probably the most common way that people are doing it. And yes, I do think that that's problematic.
I love when you talk about self-acceptance and self-love as being sort of the ultimate goals. I was just thinking that self-acceptance feels like, I suppose, a widely acknowledged goal that is sort of that we want to sort of strive for. But I sort of feel like self-love, I think maybe it's just the word sort of seems like a step in the sort of almost like an American way of like, self-love, and almost that's a bit egotistical. That's not how we're sort of, we're not meant
Brits
to.
aren't,
we're not meant to be like self-loving. Okay, self-acceptance, I guess, but don't love yourself. I don't know. Have you found like there are any cultural challenges in the work that you're doing?
I've actually been really pleasantly surprised in the UK, because obviously I spent a bit of time in LA and then the Brits aren't notorious for self-acceptance and self-love. We are, but I also love that about us. We're very self-deprecating. It's part of our humor. But actually, in the last couple of years, you can just see that this space is exploding and that there's a huge demand for it. So the problem with the self-love thing is that it's become overly commercialized. So brands are using it as like, buy this thing as an act of self-love, and that's really not what it's about. But I think it's very important to start from a young age, if possible, to normalize actually loving yourself. Because that's the thing, if I sat here, or if we met at a dinner party and I said, Guy, I love myself, the default reaction is like, God, she's up her own arse, and it shouldn't be like that. It shouldn't be odd for someone to say that they love who they are. But we are so conditioned in every direction to actually really dislike ourselves, because that's the capitalistic world that we live in, and that's why we buy so many things.
Can I ask, who here would feel confident saying that they loved themselves? If you put your hand up, would you feel confident
Don't be
in a
shy.
social setting saying, I love myself? Yeah, wow. Yeah, so it's 4. Yeah. I have to say, I don't think I would feel, and I would love to get to that point. And then obviously you start thinking, but do I love myself and everything else? And yeah, I do love myself.
I would love to actually ask from those that put their hands up, what have you always felt that way, or is it something that's a recent development, and would you mind sharing? Through the years.
I'm going to give you the mic quickly.
It's interesting, some of the stuff you said about I actually got kicked in by my first Saturn return. It was a big experience for me. So, and that set me on a path of becoming a Reiki master and doing all these other things, and kind of literally dropping all my friendship group and everything you described. Basically, I went through. I then met my wife at the College of Psychic Studies, and it kind of just blossomed there. And that's when you learn about going inside your heart and understanding about self-love. Mm-hmm. So for me, it's a big thing. It's what we are. We're kind of born from love and we return to love. So yeah.
Absolutely. Thank you for sharing that.
Born from love, return to love.
Anyone
That's
else?
beautiful.
Would you be comfortable sharing something?
So I think it's the same sort of thing, really. It's come from going within, going inward, and being a bit more, spiritual. Mm-hmm. I really didn't used to love myself at all, but I think I've become more that way just through doing lots of meditation and things like that, really.
Yeah.
And just liking myself a lot more.
Yeah.
Understanding we're all one as well, one consciousness.
Thank you for sharing that. Because I think when you start doing this type of work, you then are forced to recognize the narrative or the sort of chatter in your own mind. And I think that was very much my Saturn Return journey as well. It was like really acknowledging the way that I spoke to myself. Because I used to have these sort of bouts of depression, really. And I always thought it was really random. I thought there was no reason that it happened. There was nothing that brought it on in particular. It was just random.
And you also seemed to experience that when you were younger, and you talked about being
yeah, when I was younger, and then definitely through my 20s. And then, yeah, it was kind of when I went through my Saturn Return, I was like, I don't want to feel this way, or I don't want this to just be something I have to deal with. And I understand it's a very complex and broad subject. But for me, it was recognizing actually what was my internal dialogue like. And usually if I sort of did a graph of what was happening in my mind, the way I was speaking to myself and berating myself, that always then had a knock-on effect that would lead me to these sort of bouts of depression. And then I suddenly really had to look and be like, wow, the way I speak to myself is horrible. And that was probably the biggest piece that I worked on. And now I don't do that. But I of course, there are certain things that might trigger me, but I now have the tools to sort of acknowledge it, change the dialogue.
What trigger sort of, language, self-deprecating or breaking yourself in the moment? Yeah. Sort of noticing when it's happening, or taking time out of your week to think, when have I talked to myself?
It's more noticing it in real time and just going, oh, right, we don't do that anymore. And stopping it there and then. Whereas before I didn't even realize it was happening.
Yeah, that's what I was just thinking. You could often feel so terrible and so anxious and so lacking in confidence and conviction and being, I suppose, blocked. And there's got to be work, I suppose, to keep ourselves open. Because I mean, like you say, I wouldn't even realise some of the things I think I must say about myself.
And we think it's helpful. We think that voice is driving us along. But actually, we get to this place we want to go a lot quicker if we actually all championed ourselves.
Yeah, absolutely. Does anyone else at this point, by the way, want to add anything before we move on? But I will throw it to the floor as well. I wanted to talk about your podcast. You've got such brilliant contributors. What episodes stand out to you as particularly crucial, or ones that, if anyone's not had those particular ones, they should listen back to?
My favourite one, I always say this one, but it was a very special experience for me. But when I was going through my Saturn Return, I went through this breakup and I was completely heartbroken. I would listen to this podcast called Create the Love, which was by a man called Mark Groves. And it was a lifeline for me. Honestly, it sort of helped me so much. And he was also going through a breakup and he was sharing it on his podcast. And he became like a bit of, I mean, if you guys are into podcasts, you know, people can become sort of friends from afar and sort of heroes for you in many ways. And so I absolutely adored his work. And then I was like, I did go on to do my podcast and he was my dream guest. Wow. And then I interviewed someone that knew him. He came on the show and it kept being rearranged for various reasons. And this is like a few years on now. And I actually had gone through a few days before, and it was a sort of relationship thing had broken down. But I was like, don't turn it into a therapy episode. Like, don't turn it into a therapy session about you. But anyway, as we started talking and he started asking more and more questions, like he noticed that I did this thing when I felt uncomfortable or something was emotional.
He was asking questions on your podcast.
He sort of, he basically grabbed the reins and he was like, every time you feel a bit uncomfortable or something's emotional, you laugh. And I was like, oh, what do I? And I kept it. And then I suddenly noticed that I was doing it and it was very confronting, but he was just so grounded and he really held this space for me. And then he started asking more and more questions. And then suddenly I did start having quite an emotional response, but it was afterwards, it was just like the most beautifully healing experience for me. And when rarely am I, it's not like I'm just sharing my entire soul on this podcast, but that was a particularly vulnerable one. And I always wait a little bit of time in between airing those so I can fully sort of process it. Otherwise it's a bit much. But that was to this day my favorite.
And when you were that vulnerable, what part of your life were you focusing on when you?
That was around love and relationships.
Right.
Yeah. But also it kind of went into childhood stuff because obviously, as we all know, they're all very interlinked.
And I wanted to ask, you do such brilliant workshops as well. What do you explore in your workshops?
Well, we try and keep it under the Saturn Returns themes. So kind of a lot of questions around that time is like, who am I and what is my purpose? So helping people gain clarity on like what they're here to do. And kind of like you said, often people have this moment where they can be in perhaps a very corporate job that is just not it. It's just not what they're supposed to be doing with their life, and kind of helping people find the courage to find whatever that thing is and to take a leap of faith and do something. And it's incredible how many of the people that listen to the show have then gone on to do something that is very much in the spiritual space. And it's, I've met so many people that were like in finance and now they're doing tarot reading because they were like, I always had a gift and now I'm finally just acting on it, and my family think I'm mad, but I don't care, and it's working, and that's really lovely.
Listening to your podcast.
Well, it's helped, and people will come up to me sometimes and say, that episode on this particularly helped me, and it's a really beautiful sort of symbiotic relationship because, of course, then it holds me accountable to be a bit more courageous myself, because this is a never-ending process, and whilst I love what I do, sometimes I'm like, I know when I'm keeping myself a little bit hidden and need to sort of take a bit more of a risk and go outside of my comfort zone a little bit more. And of course, if my community are doing that, it means I'm like, okay, well, I've got to do it too.
Are you feeling like that at the moment?
I am feeling like that at the moment because the podcast has become a safe space for me, and it is for people that listen. And that is, I'm don't take that for granted. I'm incredibly lucky. But I think, that we often hold a thing like in our hearts that's our true desire. And I believe that our dreams choose us. They choose us because they want to be manifested through us. And we have all the ingredients and all the skills to bring them to life. But then we have to work through the reasons that we don't. And we all self-sabotage in various ways. And for me, I think being a creative person, putting out creative work into the world is like where I feel my most happy, but where I have the most resistance. And so now I'm really trying to hold myself accountable to do more of that.
Yeah, and what is it when you say resistance? What?
Oh, man. I mean, resistance and self-sabotage, they're just so creative, and it can be, I don't know, it's like you'll think of all the reasons why you can't do something or why it's not the right time or you need to be a better person in some way, or you'll take on another project and you just kind of make things more complicated rather than just doing the thing, or you'll do like 90% of it and then the final 10% you're like, I don't know, that bit's a bit tough. And it's like you've actually done most of the hard stuff. But releasing something into the world is of course scary, because when you hold something so close to you, the fear of like ridicule or criticism and judgment, it's like, well, if I keep it to myself, then it's safe. But actually the whole point of the gifts that you're given is to give them back.
And is this particularly music for you?
For me, music is a big part of it, yeah. And that's where I always loved singing when I was younger. But for whatever reason, I was incredibly shy and had a lot of performance anxiety. And then I was pursuing it for a while, but I found it quite hard because of the sort of the mental anguish that I went through. And now because I have the podcast going and the brand and everything, I want to be able to put out music into the world just because I love it. And I think with everything that we're moving into now with AI and technology, the human creative spirit is going to be so important, and that we all nurture that and recognize its value.
I was just going to ask, it's quite a really hard question probably, but where would we even start with that? Because, even writing questions my husband's always like, just put it through Chat. I think every answer is put it through ChatGPT.
Yeah, I don't see it as, I know people are very afraid of this sort of world that we're going into. And actually me and my boyfriend were watching The Matrix the other day, and it's suddenly got a whole new meaning because they're talking about AI in it, and you're like, wow, we're actually there. But, if we can use it as a tool to kind of enhance what we're creating and to help us out in these ways, then fantastic. But it's when it sort of becomes a substitute for human creativity, it becomes problematic when it starts replacing us.
And human
And
creativity.
that's the fear.
I was just thinking human effort as well. Like it takes.
Yeah, but I personally, if I look at a piece of art or listen to a song, I'm connecting with it because of the pain often, or the experience, and because I might be going through something like that as well, which is a human thing. You can't put that through an algorithm, or do you know what I mean? So even though technically it will be better in terms of how quickly it's done or whatever, it's not going to give you the same feeling, and therefore I'm not concerned about it.
Doesn't have the soul.
Doesn't have the soul.
I want to throw now, because we've got about 15 minutes left.
We've gone off on a complete tangent.
20 minutes. No, it's brilliant. But I just wanted to ask, is there any questions at all for Caggie, or anything that's come up that you would like to share? There's absolutely no pressure.
Yeah, great.
I'm going to come over.
Sorry, thank you. Sorry if it's a bit personal, but did you ever feel when you were younger, so we were big fans many years ago, did you find that your surroundings, given situation, environment, that was, when you made a decision, hang on, this is not how I'm meant to live, that your environment was trying to pull you back or keep you?
100%. Yeah, it was trying to keep me.
Because everyone's trying to kind of like, even be like, do this, don't do that, why are you doing that? Did you have that? And was it really hard to go against that when you recognise this is not what I need to do?
It was really hard. And I think the hardest part was actually when I then started to doubt myself, because it was such a strong, intuitive knowing, but no, it didn't make sense to anyone else from the outside. They were like, well, you know, that doesn't, you should definitely keep doing this, blah, blah, blah. And it just felt very, it got to the point where it wasn't even something I needed to weigh up anymore. I just knew.
And was being judged for doing something different to what was expected of you, was there ever a concern for you?
It was hard. It was hard because there were a few years where I was like, I don't actually, what if I don't know what I'm doing? Or what if there isn't something else that's more aligned for me? But of course, like, you get to the point where you realize, like, that journey is what led you there. You couldn't just get there straight away. And we love this idea that, like, life is this straightforward trajectory from A to B. And it's like, oh, I want to be this person, so I'll just, like, go after that now. But sometimes life needs to throw you off in different directions, and it's a maze. But it's by the time you get to where you're supposed to be, you've picked up all of the wisdom and through all of those experiences that allow you to actually sustain it. Otherwise, we wouldn't be able to.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I wanted to ask how you look back on the Made in Chelsea time of your life.
Well, now I do sort of like the Voldemort of my life. I'm like, oh, goodness. I mean, I do. It's sort of like attending a very small university that was documented. You know, that's the way I feel about the people on the show. Like, I love them dearly. And the bond that we have with the ones that I was friends with before and throughout the show and continue to be, like, it's a really incredible, like, bond that you form from having that experience. But it just wasn't what I was supposed to be doing. I think it was at that moment in time, but that very much reflected what we spoke about earlier, of this sort of desire to fit in. And I think through my teen years, I was like, oh, I think if I'm this type of person, I'll be happy and I won't feel these feelings that I don't think other people feel, and I won't have these, like, periods of melancholy and stuff like that. And so it was very much a manifestation of, like, oh, well, this is what it's about. And then I was just very at odds with myself.
Even at the time? At
the time, yeah, because it sort of felt like a version of me was, like, taking off and I couldn't really control it. And it outshadowed me, you know?
It was so huge.
Yeah,
it was one of the, what was the first? It was the absolute first one of its kind, really.
I mean, my astrologer, Nora, said yesterday, she was talking about it, and she said, you know, remember when you were on TOEI? And I was like, do you mean TOEI? And she said, TOEI. And I was like, I wasn't on TOEI, but I love that you're calling it TOEI. Oh, it was so funny. But yeah, it was, but at this, you know, I wouldn't be here if it wasn't for that experience. And actually, I love the trajectory that I've kind of gone down, because it's not a straightforward one, but that's what makes it feel so much more meaningful for me now. And so I look back at it fondly, but it was a crazy baptism of fire into sort of the public. Yeah.
Absolutely. Do we have any other questions?
I feel like people often have questions and they're like shy.
Is that you?
And they're shy, and then afterwards they're like, I had a question, but I didn't want to ask it. So this is a safe space. Speak now.
I wanted to ask what comes next, because you have done so much. I mean, you actually... We obviously we're talking about Saturn Returns, you know, and I know they've got the 7 years. I think you could almost write a book for every 7 years.
Yeah.
What does come next for you? How much do you have in your mind? Did you just call it the Saturn Square?
Yeah.
Yeah. How much of that is sort of in your mind with what comes next?
Well, I'm aware that, so at the moment I sort of feel like, is this going to be a solidifying of where I'm at, in that it's going to be sort of children, marriage and stuff, or is it going to be a sudden, like, another pivot into a different direction? And I don't really know, but I'm actually okay with that. And I think it's okay to do the sort of normal stuff, but I always like to really question it to make sure that I'm doing it for the right reasons, rather than just being sort of funneled into the status quo of society. So I feel like there's a lot more that I want to build with Saturn Returns and get it out to more people and build the community, because I think it's important. Yeah.
How is Saturn Returns viewed sort of globally? Are people sort of aware and exploring it in all parts of the world?
Yes. Our audience is mainly UK, then Australia, then the US. But I would like to create more of a presence in those places and maybe do some workshops or retreats there. And because, you know, I think I was just lucky that my existing audience happened to be at probably the right age, and the lion's share is women who tend to gravitate towards this sort of work a little bit more than men, not always, but typically. And so now it's about actually accessing those people that might be going through it but have no idea who I am and have never heard of the podcast. It's like, well, how do we find those people? And I tend to be quite a sort of just let things naturally unfold, and who's meant to find it will. But now maybe it's about putting a bit more infrastructure and behind it. Yeah.
And what about the second Saturn return? What for obvious reasons, our focus is the first Saturn return, but what can we say about the second Saturn return? How can people approach it in that time of their life?
Well, your second Saturn return is sort of about legacy building. So what's the legacy that you're leaving behind? So it can be equally tumultuous in its own way. And you sort of are faced with, you know, how have I been living the last 30 years? What have I been doing? And what do I want to do now? What I think is I would love to see more of is people in that space. Like my mum's now working with a life coach of like, what she wants to do next, because she's like, I'm not ready to just like start playing tennis and that's it. You know, she wants to actually do more, and she's got the mind for it. So she's trying to think of like what her next thing is, and I would love to see more of that, because I do think it's this another turning point, and then you can really take the wisdom that you have and share it with other people. Yeah.
And then you mentioned a retreat. What do they look like?
So we're doing, the retreats are really beautiful because it's an opportunity for me to connect with the community in a very intimate way and kind of take them through a journey over the course of 5-6 days. We're about to launch a sort of mini summit, which will be for like 35 people in Greece in October.
In Greece?
In Greece, wow. Yeah. And so that will be more of like the podcast as an experience, as a sort of transformational experience throughout a week with different practitioners, different healers, different workshops, so people can come and actually, deep dive into that and their own personal development stuff throughout the week, whilst also, of course, meeting with other like-minded members of the community.
Oh, beautiful. Do I have any questions? Well, it all sounds so brilliant. It all sounds so brilliant. If you have got any questions or anything that you'd like to sort of directly talk to Caggie about, obviously, please feel that you can. How have you enjoyed the festival here? Have you seen it?
I've loved it. And I think, you know, it's so nice to see how many of these sorts of things are popping up, and that you know, echoes the fact that there's a real need and desire for people to connect and an interest in this space. So I've loved it. I'm going to go and I don't know what it was called, but I'm going to go and do this thing, which is like some sort of head thing. I don't know. I love just trying all of this stuff out. I just saw it, and it sort of was about giving you clarity. And this woman looked like she was in seventh heaven, just like, I was like, I need some of that after the talk. I thought if I did it before, I might sort of fall asleep.
You don't when you're falling asleep. What about you? Have you got any recommendations from this festival so far? Anyone done anything particularly brilliant? You've just arrived, but you will be doing something brilliant. Let me give you the mic.
It's nice to come to these things because obviously you might talk about products and things that you can do, or you might see it on Instagram, but you haven't, it's just a picture and you're not quite sure, and then you get to meet the people and hear their stories and where their products come from and why they're doing things. And I feel like you feel much more connected than just buying products.
Yeah, definitely. And actually, as you said that, I feel sort of similar. I feel like I've actually carried the Wellness Festival. I've only gone to this Wellness Festival, I think, ever. I don't know if anyone can recommend any others, but I've actually carried the last one with me, actually. I think through the year, I do feel connected. My life is quite can feel a bit chaotic. I run a homeless charity, and it's all very new territory because we give showers to people in need. It's called Showerbox. I'm just going to plug it. And one of the reasons I love being at this wellness festival is because a lot of the practical tips and practical guidance is sort of starting small, and what are the simple moves you can make when everything feels very complex and unmanageable and sort of like a boulder to try and get going. So the idea of Showerbox is obviously, how did everyone feel this morning, probably yesterday when they had a shower, how rejuvenated did you feel? And so hoping that, and it is the case that our guests will go on to work from our showers. But yeah, it all feels very fitting to be in this sort of wellness space. And yeah, I'm never, ever really in it. I feel like just these 2 days, and then I get spat out into chaos, it feels like. So I love actually interviewing and being able to actually, interview people that can give us some sort of practical tips. Do you have any, put you on the spot, have you got any sort of takeaway homeable tips that you sort of say? What are the sort of central lessons, I guess, through Saturn and perhaps besides?
Well, I think the central lesson is just kind of, it sounds very cliche, but trusting in the process. And also, as people are like, do you have day-to-day practices that you do? And I do, and I always love leaning into different sort of esoteric things and trying things out and seeing different healers and practitioners. But probably the main takeaway of Saturn, your Saturn return, is for you to ultimately carve out and find your own autonomy and authority, and to know that you have everything you need. And whilst I love going and seeing a tarot reader and all of this kind of stuff, sometimes it reinforces that you're subcontracting your authority onto other people. And so actually finding moments of stillness and checking in with yourself, not necessarily to achieve anything or find anything, but just practicing it, because we're constantly busying around, distracting ourselves, filling our days, having several screens going on at once. So actually just tuning in and to sort of go back to what we were discussing a bit before about the self-love piece, like noticing the thoughts and feelings, the sensations in your body when you are just on your own. Like, how does that feel? And if it's really uncomfortable, like, that's okay. Just kind of do a few minutes and then practice it again and see what you can do to help that. Is it some breathing exercises? Is it some mantras? Is it a meditation? But just the more you kind of practice those moments, then hopefully you get to a point where you kind of recognize, like, that becomes your safe space. And that's the ultimate goal, I think.
That's really beautiful. I think on that note, if nobody has a question, then we'll finish sort of 5 minutes early. If anyone can come and talk to you. And thank you so much, Caggie Dunlop.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for coming. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you for listening to our Wow Talks podcast. If you enjoyed today's episode, please be sure to subscribe and leave us a review. And we'd love for you to share your own wisdom on wellness. Join the conversation, share this episode with a friend, or follow us on social media for more updates at Wisdom on Wellness. Until next time.